Alright, welcome back and thanks for tuning in to another episode of barSILENCE. My name is Jameson and I'm your host. barSILENCE is a SuperPod Network production that's dedicated to exploring the very best video game music each and every month. If you haven't yet, head over to barsilence.com to find an easy link to subscribe on whatever your favorite podcatcher is. You can also go to superpodnetwork.com to check out an excellent variety of gaming articles, as well as some of the best podcasts that are focused on retro gaming nostalgia and other gaming goodness. And of course, if you're looking for the best 24/7 around-the-clock video game music radio station, you should check out 8 Beats Radio. This show plays there live on the first Tuesday of every month, and you can tune in by going to 8beats.co. In this episode, we're listening to the creative fusion of genres in the cutting-edge soundtracks to Shinobi and Nightshade on the PlayStation 2. Sega's Shinobi series began in arcades in 1987, starring a modern-day ninja named Joe Musashi, who's on a mission to rescue hostages from an evil syndicate. Shinobi essentially arrived at the perfect moment in time when Western pop culture was totally obsessed with ninjas. These mysterious, stylish, and stealthy ninjas dominated movies, cartoons, and video games throughout the late 80s and early 90s. And thanks to that, Shinobi went on to become a major Sega franchise that would also be released on the Game Gear, as well as having two well-loved Genesis sequels, Revenge of Shinobi in 1989 and Shinobi 3, Return of the Ninja Master in 1993. Then, in 1995, Sega released Shinobi Legions, known as Shinobi X in Europe, for the Sega Saturn. This game was well received, and it was praised for its flashy FMV cutscenes, the use of digitized sprites a la Mortal Kombat, and the Western release's soundtrack by the venerable Richard Jakes. Now, in the 7 years following Shinobi Legions, the video game industry went through massive changes. We saw Nintendo lose its market dominance, Sony's PlayStation surged to the forefront of the console wars, and Sega's Dreamcast launched to great hype and then shortly later died, marking Sega's exit from the hardware business. By the early 2000s, a new three-way competition had emerged between the PlayStation 2, the GameCube, and the new Xbox. This is when Sega embraced its new role as a third-party developer and began strategically delivering its most important franchises across the competing platforms. They brought Jet Set Radio Future, House of the Dead 3, Shenmue 2, and ToeJam and Earl 3 to the Xbox. The PlayStation 2 saw ports of Rez, Echo the Dolphin, and Space Channel 5. And the once unthinkable happened when Nintendo became the home of Sonic Adventure 2 Battle. Nintendo also received Super Monkey Ball, Skies of Arcadia Legends, and Sega's online RPG, Phantasy Star Online. But through all of this, there was no new Shinobi. Sega's overworked studio did start plans for the Dreamcast, but that moved over to the increasingly popular PlayStation 2 instead, utilizing the Emotion Engine and giving gamers an all-new, all 3D ninja experience. Titled simply Shinobi, this game introduces us to Hotsuma, a young ninja master and new leader of the Oboro clan. While Hotsuma's away on a government contract, a massive earthquake strikes Tokyo, leaving the city in ruins. When he returns, he finds the Oboro clan nearly wiped out by hordes of demonic hellspawn that have been ravaging the city. At the center of all this chaos stands a towering golden plaza conjured by the evil sorcerer Haruko, who is also the one responsible for unleashing those very same hellspawn that murdered the Oboro clan. Now, as the last of his kind, Hotsuma sets out for revenge, wielding the cursed demon blade Akujiki. This katana is essentially a demonic parasite that consumes the souls of its victims and must continually be fed, or the unfortunate demise of its handlers next. Haruko's evil plan is to absorb the yin of the souls that Akujiki has been taking and use it to rule the earth. And, in a twisted way, Hatsuma's fed by vengeance as much as the sword's fueled by souls. He ultimately ends up delivering exactly what Haruko wanted leading up to the final battle. Now, when Shinobi was released, it was praised by reviewers for its stylish, reimagined take on ninja action. They also highlighted the game's graphics, the sleek semi-futuristic redesign of Hotsuma, as well as the red scarf that traces behind him, giving players a way to follow the lightning-fast action on screen. The thing is, that action is also notoriously hard. Most reviewers commented on the high difficulty, with Electronic Gaming Monthly calling it hellaciously hard, and OneUp.com referring to it as one of the toughest games they had played. This, of course, was years before the Soulsborne genre turned punishing and unforgiving gameplay into a badge of honor. So it's no surprise that Shinobi carved out a cult following of its own by being just as challenging. I can attest to this too. I used to love this game's atmosphere, running on walls, building chain kills together that would trigger these super cool cinematic slow-mo finishers, and of course, the game's genuinely cool soundtrack. But man, it was hard and regrettably remains unbeaten all these years later. Now, speaking of that soundtrack, this new era of Shinobi was brought to life by 5 incredibly talented composers who delivered a sound that fuses traditional Japanese instruments with rock and techno. The result is an exotic, techno-futuristic, and rhythmically intense soundtrack that perfectly matches the game's sharp visuals and blistering pace. In fact, the song that opened the show, called Patience by Yutaka Minobe, is a short and dramatic example of that intensity and blend of genres. We're going to start off this block of ninja tunes with Transfiguration by Tatsuyuki Maeda, and follow it with two more of his tracks called Moritsune and Waiting Place. After those, we're going to move into 3 tracks by Fumie and Kumatani called Destroyed by Fire, Strange Device, and Red Blade. All 3 of these are great examples of that seamless blend of techno beats with classical Japanese instruments. Then, last, we're going to listen to Golden Castle by Teruhiko Nakagawa to finish this block. Alright, let's get into the soul-slicing sounds of Shinobi on the PS2, and I'll be back after that to talk about the sequel, Nightshade. After Shinobi was released in 2002, Sega followed up the next year with a direct sequel known as Kunoichi in Japan that was later retitled Nightshade when it was released in the West in 2004. The ending of Shinobi saw Hotsuma victorious over the evil sorcerer, but he chose not to escape the collapsing Golden Palace. Instead, he sacrificed himself in order to end the burden of the demon sword Akujiki and causing it to break, which effectively ended its curse. Nightshade picks up a year after those events from the first game and follows a deadly ninja named Hibana, who was originally part of the Oboro clan and is now part of the government Shinobi agency. The story starts after the seal containing Akujiki is broken, and the Nakatomi Corporation, who is behind empowering that evil sorcerer from the first game, are now heading into the city and trying to obtain the sword. So Hibana is assigned to stop them at all costs, close the gate that's allowed the Hellspawn into this world, and obtain the sword for herself. Now, during development, Sega was noted for saying that they were going to try and relax some of that difficulty for the sequel, but keep the core gameplay intact. Nightshade thankfully does alleviate some of those more painful aspects from Shinobi, with faster gameplay, smoother movements through levels, more rewarding combos, and a mid-level checkpoint system to ease that frustration of having to completely start a level over every time you die. The game also includes new modes like training and mission mode that help committed players refine their skills. Plus, if you had a Shinobi save file on your memory card, you could unlock Hotsuma as a playable character. Critics generally praise Nightshade for building on Shinobi's foundation, highlighting Hibana's smooth movements, brighter color palette, and the consistent 60 frames per second performance. However, Nightshade was criticized for its challenging later levels and the occasionally repetitive gameplay. So, when Nightshade was released in early 2004, post-holiday and pre-summer in the West, the game ended up flying under the radar for many gamers, and ultimately leaving it to underperform in the market. After that, the Shinobi series ended up sitting dormant on the shelves of Sega until 2011, when they released another game called Shinobi that was a 2.5D side-scroller for the Nintendo 3DS that was also met with fairly mediocre reviews. It would then be another 12 years without Shinobi until 2023, when Sega surprised fans by announcing Shinobi Art of Vengeance, which is releasing in 2025. This return to 2D action brings back the legendary Joe Musashi in a stunning hand-drawn art style, and the trailers show a clear commitment to the original game's formula, which should probably be pretty cool. Now, to get back to Nightshade, this soundtrack evolves the Japanese fusion style from Shinobi into a faster drum and bass-like approach for many of the songs. Yutaka Minobe, Teruhiko Nakagawa, and Fumie Kumatani all returned for a few tracks, but the majority of the music was handled by Tomonori Sawada, Masaru Setsumaru, and Keiichi Sugiyama. The result of this soundtrack feels like you're racing through a near-future Tokyo, perfectly matching Hibana's speed and lethal elegance. To kick off this block of tunes, we're going to listen to the ambient, almost Tron-like sounds of Conspiracy Bottomless by Tomonori Sawada. Next, we'll follow with one of the more techno-sounding tunes called Ascetic Practice by Masaru Setsumaru. Then, we'll pick up the pace with Overcome Speed by Keiichi Sugiyama, and then hear the rhythmic beats of Skyscraper Tokyo, also by Sugiyama. Next, we'll get into an excellent fusion of drum and bass with Japanese instrumentation in the appropriately named Dark Kingdom. I love this song's overall vibe and how it really sets a scene for the player. Following that, we'll hear the epic beats of Apparition Sovereign by Tomonori Sawada. This song is especially cool sounding, and it's probably one of my favorites on the soundtrack. We'll follow it with the dreamy synths and swift beats of Impossible Maze by Yutaka Minobe, and then we'll hear the blazing drums and return of Japanese instrumentation in Monochrome Arch by Sawada. Finally, we're going to listen to two more Sawada tracks that I've mixed together called Iron Will and Iron Shogun. These tracks go really hard on the breakbeats and drum and bass pace, and together they create a seriously awesome sound that I absolutely love. These two tracks are probably my other favorites from this soundtrack, and I think you're really going to like them too. Okay, let's get into these ninja beats. It's time for action. Enjoy these tunes, and I'll be back after that. Alright, that's the show. I hope you enjoyed these seriously awesome soundtracks from Shinobi and Nightshade. If you want to interact with the show and tell me what you think about my selections in this episode, you can follow me on a variety of social media platforms. That includes Blue Sky, Threads, and Instagram. Following the show in those locations are exactly where you can find great screenshots, artwork, music clips, and various information about the games that are featured in each episode. Check the show notes to follow along on your favorite platform of choice. If you're enjoying this show's selection of incredibly great video game music each month, please consider taking a moment to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Pocket Cast, Overcast, YouTube, or wherever you're listening to this show, because I'd really love to hear what you think. Don't forget, you can go to barsilence.com to listen to past shows if you've missed any, and of course, if you're feeling giving, you can always support barSILENCE on Patreon. For already subscribing, I want to thank the members of the Legion of VGM for supporting the show. Zoe, Alusa, Cameron, Reptile, and Poppy the Mask Eaten, you Master Ninjas are the best, and I really hope you've enjoyed this episode. Now, if you want to join our Ninja Clan and become a member of the Legion of VGM yourself, you can subscribe for as little or as much as you want. Be sure to check those show notes for a link to learn more. I would also like to thank friends of the show and Legion members Aaron of the excellent video game variety podcast, SuperPod Saga, as well as Professor Tom of the Shujin Academy VGM Club. You can and should check out both of these shows wherever you find your podcasts, as well as on TerraPlayer.com. Alright, like always, I've got one more excellent tune to take us out. We're going to listen to Kan Iji Neo from Nightshade by Teruhiko Nakagawa. This spacey sounding tune once more blends classic Japanese instruments with a swift drum and bass like beat, turning it into a grooving and ultimately smooth track that sounds exactly like 2004. Anyway, that's all for now. Enjoy this final song, and as always, thanks again for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.